Welcome to the Attract Your Ideal Clients podcast. This show is for entrepreneurs who sell their expertise, including trainers, consultants, and coaches looking for real-world, actionable marketing advice to help them identify their competitive strengths, find and fix the marketing bottlenecks that are holding them back, and confidently make the right marketing decisions for their unique business. In today's episode, we'll be looking at what to say when meeting someone new. How do you tell people how you might be able to help them or someone they know, and do it in a way that doesn't come off as salesy, generic, or self-centered? Joining me today is Pamela King, founder of Pamela King Consulting. Now, before we get started, if you've hit a plateau in your training, consulting, or coaching business, I want to invite you to visit marcusschaller.com/subscribe for weekly troubleshooting guides and tips to help you find and fix the weak spots in your marketing that are holding you back, fine-tune your positioning and marketing strategy, and start growing again by attracting more of your ideal clients. Again, that's marcusschaller.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me today. You and I had spoken originally a little over a week ago when we first connected. And just to create a little context for people listening, we're going to talk a little bit today about a little bit of a challenge that you face with your messaging. How do you describe what you do to people? Because what you do is not, it's kind of, you've created your own category essentially, right? So we're going to dive into that. But to start out, if you could just tell people really briefly just what you do and who you work with, the kind of problems you solve.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and get your good guidance and connect with your audience. So I'm Pamela King, owner of Pamela King Consulting, your small business optimizer, which, as you mentioned, is a role that I've invented. I don't know anyone else who provides the services I do. So I am not a coach. That's usually what I have to start with. I am brought on by busy entrepreneurs for targeted short-term contracts to build out the operations side of their business. So I provide done-for-you work, creating systems, templates, checklists, building habits. And after a few months, we're done, and they have that framework that allows them to scale sustainably and reach all their goals.
And the trick here is, as you've mentioned when we first spoke, is taking all that, right? Which isn't that much. The way you described it was very succinct and to the point. So
I've been practicing. Thank you.
well, of course, we all do, right? It's like if you're anything like me, the first version might not have been anything close to that, right?
No.
The trick now is like we were talking, it's like, well, when you're meeting somebody for a first time, let's say at a conference or in an event or something, well, you don't really have necessarily all the time to do the full thing. Or even when somebody's maybe going on your LinkedIn or they go to your website or whatever, the small business optimizer is a great, now that I know what you do, or before when I didn't, once we first spoke, yeah, of course, small business optimizer makes total sense, but that's really only after the fact. So I'm curious, when you speak to people about this, like what are the circumstances where this even comes up, just so we can like keep it specific to the are you at events, is it face to face, like when does this become a challenge basically?
Yeah, well, it's networking. I've been really fortunate that the majority of my business comes from referrals. And that's because I think that is people who've been able to have more of an extended conversation. But when people hear, oh, well, she really helped me with my business, then people think, oh, you're a coach, you're a VA, are you, like some sort of content creator, those are the things. Copywriting, I think. I still think my dad thinks I'm a copywriter, but so that's it, is like, if you, and, when I was first choosing this, I'm like, I don't know anyone who's doing this. I kind of fell into it. I was an educator for 15 years, and I have a dear friend who's a realtor. That realtor was working with a business coach. The coach told her in order to grow, it was time to hire an assistant, start having client appreciation events. I didn't think I was starting a business. I was like, it's going to be summer break. Bring me on. I'll just help you out. And I did these things. And my natural teacher tendency was to build out the framework, create the SOPs, make it so it was kind of copy paste. So at the end of the summer when I left, it was easy for her to slot someone else in. So I knew what I was kind of doing, and then it got referred to some other people, and eventually you realize, oh, maybe this is a business. So I knew what I was doing, but there was no language around it. So a lot of trial and error for a while. And I had an entire set of business cards that said, um, business development specialist. And I was like, that's what I do. That's a sales position. I didn't know. I didn't come from corporate. I came from school. I still think I'm right. I still think I am a business development specialist.
Leave that one alone. We'll talk about that on a different episode.
Okay, okay. But that was it. So kind of playing around with it. I love working with those early solopreneurs, kind of like 1 to 5, 5 to 10. That's really my preferred people. So small business made sense. And then it's like, am I a growth, a specialist? And sometimes we could fall down a rabbit hole of like fun job titles, right? Like systems maven or operations rock star. But operations consultant also doesn't feel right. That's probably the closest, most aligned thing. But to me, an operations consultant is like a mid-sized manufacturer is having supply chain issues. That's who brings on an operations consultant. That's not me, and I'm not for them. So that's what it's myself even getting my arms around the right terminology for it. And then how do I clarify that for my audience?
No, it's such a, when you're doing something that's not just very obvious, we had talked about if you're a real estate agent, most people just know, oh, okay, for better or worse, they know what a real estate agent does, or
Yeah.
an accountant, or anything like that, right? And so just to play around for a second with how to approach this in an in-person thing, and we could talk later about how that might be applied to your website or something that you're technically your marketing messaging and your LinkedIn, things like that. But just starting, you said it's mostly, or at least a lot of times, it's like in live events, right? You're
Oh, yeah.
networking, you're in an event, right? Um, Pretend I'm meeting you for the first time, right?
Sure.
You don't know me at all. I don't know you at all. And I ask the ever so clever intro question, what do you do? Right? Because nobody ever thinks of asking that. I'm just kidding.
Right.
Right. So we're talking and whatever. And I say, what do you do? So I'm assuming that that's where it comes up, right? Somebody asks you what you do. And now it's kind of
Mhm.
like, how do I describe it? So don't try to get it perfect, whatever. Just kind of give me a gist, like we're in a live situation. I'm meeting you for the first time. What will you tell me?
Well, I kind of already said it, that I am not a coach, that busy entrepreneurs bring me on for short-term contracts. I help build out the infrastructure they need for sustainable growth. And sometimes if they really seem like they're struggling, I say, my mom thinks it calls me Mary Poppins, and that kind of helps. And people laugh. And it's okay. Yeah, I come on for a little bit, that idea, a little bit of housekeeping, but she didn't stay forever. So that kind of helps. It's a silly little metaphor, but it works.
That's interesting. Now, in that conversation, the way you just described that, do you say I'm a small business optimizer first?
I say it first, and if it doesn't seem like the coin's dropping, then I kind of say, my mom says I'm Mary Poppins. I come in and I help sometimes, but it is that idea of operation side systems temp. It's the tedious, it's the time consuming. It's all those things we know we should be doing, but just never get to. And maybe you have an administrative assistant or an office manager, but they aren't always the high level thinker person. And so I kind of come in again in a targeted contract and sort of am the architect of the system. And then I leave and they live in it.
That makes sense. And when you meet people in this context, I mean, other than the obvious, what we call just networking, which means so many different things to different people, but when you're thinking about what you're trying to achieve in that conversation, you're meeting somebody. For me, if I'm in that situation, the holy grail is meeting a potential prospect,
Sure.
right? And second to that is meeting somebody who might know a potential prospect. That's kind of why I don't go to networking events, by the way, because ultimately it's kind of like, well, that's everybody's just trying to find their own client, which is a whole different
Mm.
conversation. But just so I understand the framework or the context for those conversations. So one thing too is that it's interesting that we've all heard about the importance of the elevator pitch, right?
Totally.
And I have I've been going to networking events since the 90s. So I was around, when somebody hands you a card and you hand them a card and then they pretend to be interested in you and you pretend to be interested. Like I have my own baggage with that. But what's interesting, the elevator pitch, and I read this, I think Book Yourself Solid, he has a new version out for coaches and consultants. And I remember reading the original version of that book probably 20 years ago or something. So he was talking about elevator pitches basically being they came from like the VC world. So if you're trying to find investors and you literally have 20 seconds to hook somebody with that, it's a very different context than a networking function or that when you're just engaging with people in real life, right? So one of the challenges with an elevator pitch or whatever, however it is, like whether you've got it like where it's very easy to say what you do, is that ultimately it puts us in a position where we feel pressure to say something so interesting to somebody, right?
Yeah.
That they're going to be like, wow, that's amazing. So just imagine you were able to put the whole I'm a small business optimizer in a way that just was like, oh, it's just like poetry. But the reality is in most cases, what is everybody thinking about at that moment?
Right. And usually people are they are scrambling. So in education, right, we call that a schema, like a mind
Mm,
map.
mm,
And I'm sure that comes from psychology, but they want to put you in a box, right? Oh, so you're a coach? You're a VA? Oh, you help? Or
mm,
you do, and that's it, is that and because um, I joke that sometimes I just wish I was a graphic designer just because it like auto fills in. You're like, oh, I know what that is. I know a follow-up question. When I
mm.
said, oh, I'm a teacher, everyone goes, oh, well, what grade do you teach? Oh, what school district? Oh, do you like it gives them more and not just from a conversational perspective, but also just a way to like interact with you. And because the great news is I'm making it up. I'm having a great time. I have no competitors, but the flip side of the coin is it's not a common thing. So people can't put you into that mind map. And there is a disconnect. And it either is, wow, I'm sparked and I'm going to ask follow-up questions because
Mm.
what you're saying is so interesting. Or if it's like, oh, that's nice. Oh, I've got to talk to them now.
Yeah, and the thing is to the competitors, we all have competitors, right? Even if we don't have anybody exactly doing the same thing. I mean, competition, the worst competition or the hardest competition to fight against is doing nothing, right? I mean,
Yeah,
they'll just do
true.
nothing about it. So, but it's interesting too because if you think about it, like again, in the context where you're meeting people socially or whatever, we're all wired to want to talk about ourselves or thinking about ourselves. That's just the way we're all wired, right? I mean, you're meeting somebody, they want to tell you what they do, you tell them what you do. One thing that I've seen this in different contexts, but a way that I think is really I think personally more effective, right? When it comes down to not feeling the pressure to like figure out the perfect wording for what we do in a way that's going to mesmerize them and just, whatever, is really start out with, and this is more of a selling methodology. This is more of like when you're in that kind of sales um, movement where you're initiating essentially the whole point is to initiate a conversation, right? That's the whole goal of this. It's like there's some people that are just not going to be a good fit no matter what. They're not going to be interested no matter what. They don't know anybody else that would be. Cool. You meet them. Nice to meet you, whatever. But for the people that are going to be potentially good prospects or know people that would be, it's really about getting that conversation going. And one of the ways that I really like to approach it, that's just to consider, and I'm sure you've seen this too, but just for people listening that might not have, is kind of leading not even with what you do, right? Not even like, oh, I made this and I help people do this, but almost like a question. Like one way to say it would be like, well, you know how sometimes business owners they blank and then whatever the problem would be. Now, you
Mhm.
might say that and they might be like, no, right? Okay, right from the bat, you know that they don't have the problem, right?
Right.
Or they might just nod and be like, oh, yeah, I guess, if the right people, if you're talking to the right person, and we can get into in a minute, like how to specifically state the problem. But if you say something like, you know how business owners blank, and then the problem, which we'll talk about in a second,
Hmm.
if somebody experiences that problem,
you're going to have their attention,
Okay.
right? I mean,
Hmm.
just one way to look at it. Now you have their attention, and now they're like, yeah, but they might not even say it because they're just being courteous or just playing close to the vest. And that's when then now you can get into, well, what I do is I help whatever. I help
Okay.
entrepreneurs who are blank. I help all entrepreneurs who are growing and need to systemize their business, optimize that, create systems so that they can, and then whatever the outcome. Now, this could be said in a million different ways. This is just a very loose framework, but it's the main difference is whether you're starting with, I'm a blank and I do all this stuff versus asking if they're even like, can they relate to a problem,
Okay.
right? So even people that do what we would consider very traditional jobs that we all get. So even a designer, you said sometimes you wish you were a graphic designer. Did you say that
Yeah,
specifically?
yeah.
If somebody says, let's say it's even that. Hi, what do you do? Well, I'm a graphic designer and I like to do logos and stuff. And it's like, great, okay, now what? Versus if, because every graphic designer says the same thing. I'm a graphic
Mhm.
designer. I help companies build their website or whatever. Great. Versus, well, you know how sometimes somebody who's building their business, they start out with kind of a do-it-yourself website and they find it kind of like it's not as effective as they need it to be.
Mhm.
So what I do is I work with small business owners to take that website to the next level so that they can attract more client, whatever. It's forget
Oh,
about the way I'm
yeah.
saying, but it's more about like that now they're creating a context for the problem they solve, which is to the right people going to be much more interesting than I'm a graphic designer. To the wrong people, none of it's going to be interesting, right?
Yeah.
So, again, none of this is something that is like groundbreakingly like original for me by any stretch, but it's just something that I've seen be used, particularly in very competitive industries where like it's hard to differentiate and can be commoditized really, really easily. So that said, just what are your thoughts on that so far? Have you seen that out in the world? Have you tried that?
Um, I don't know if I've seen it because I think I would have resonated with it because as you say, I'm like, oh, I probably would have tried that. I do like that. So it's we start with kind of establishing the baseline, the problem, right? So like, you know how entrepreneurs are so busy, they have to do all the things, and even if they have staff, eventually everything's falling back on them anyway. Well, I help create the systems and the framework so that they can stay in their zone of genius and does it successfully delegate or, have things where they it runs more smoothly and kind of pull that busyness out of the business. Yeah.
Totally, right? Because
Okay.
now you're saying in language, and then it can even relate to, and depending on how they might ask you, like, "Oh, cool! Like, how would you do that?" Well, now there's a real interest there; they can relate to it, right?
Yeah.
And it just starts the conversation because ultimately it takes the pressure off in some ways. If you think about, if you say, do you know how sometimes entrepreneurs, blah, 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 or sometimes these people, I'll give you a great example. You and I were just talking before we hit record about we're buying a house. We're in the middle of buying a house. I almost didn't go with trying to find a buyer's agent. I can't imagine what a mess this would be if I didn't, right? So if I was, let's say I was at a networking thing or I just was out and about and I met somebody who's a real estate agent, and I said, "What are you doing?" They're like, "Oh, I'm a real estate agent." I'm like, "Great, okay." But if they said to me, "You know how sometimes when you're trying to buy a house in a hard market, a difficult, tricky market, and it's like you just don't even know where to start, and you feel like you're never going to find a house." Like what I do is I work with people that are looking for a house, and I help them navigate a really tough seller's market right now. Oh, yeah, of course I'm going to be like, "What?"
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to be leaning in. I'm not going to just be like, "Oh, great, nice to meet you," because I would be in that position where I would be very interested in talking to them. Where if they just said real estate agent, now I'm going to come in with all my own biases and baggage of what I think that
Hmm.
means. So, just as an example for people that can relate to what a real estate agent is, even something that's a commodity industry, which real estate really is, right? It
Yeah.
just is. You could take that and make a decision about like you're not going to be everybody's real estate agent. You're not going to be everybody's business optimizer, right? So it's just another way to look at the language itself is very specific. That's a different conversation, right? So with the way I described it is definitely not the wording, that you would use.
Yeah, no, but I see it. And I understand the framework. That is really interesting. And again, right, that's the value is
Mm,
kind of focusing on the main. And I mean, I guess I've talked about that, like focus on the problem you solve.
yeah.
But it's interesting to really lead with it in this kind of straightforward way.
Yes, and I mean it's kind of, way I approach messaging in general, right? It's like a lot of times you see on a website, particularly for trainers, coaches, and consultants, right? It'll be like live up to your next, reach the next level and all that. It's tricky when you talk about the benefits first because it can get very generic very quickly, right? There's
Mhm.
only so many ways to say reach the next level or live up to your highest potential. Like at some point, it all just starts looking the same. When you
Yeah,
talk about problems, we all experience different types of problems, right? We all experience problems in different, unique ways. What might be a challenge for me might be easy for you, and vice versa, right?
sure.
So I'm sure you've talked to entrepreneurs and small business owners who love creating their own optimization, love creating their own systems, right? They
Yeah,
do. Maybe they don't, right? But I mean,
yeah,
some
some,
people have
I mean,
more of an appetite than others, right?
right.
Yeah. So, how we word the problem, if you think about what we're all doing every day, we're focusing, everything's triage, right? Everything is just trying to put out whatever the biggest fire, the most urgent fire of the moment. So, yes, we all want to optimize. Well, forget, I won't say optimize because that's part of the thing, but we all want to self-actualize. We all want to reach our potential. But
Yeah,
at the same time, there's just stuff we got to deal with. And when you think about urgency, the people that are really going to be your ideal clients, there is a point where the urgency and the importance of the problem to them at that moment, how much of a priority it is for them, is really what makes them an ideal client or not. You could work with everybody. You could, I'm sure, create value for everybody that runs a business. The difference between somebody who's going to be a really good fit for you or not is a lot of times going to be based on how urgent that problem is to them. How much, I don't want to say pain, I don't want to make it about making like you're digging into the pain point. They know whether it's a pain. You don't
yeah,
even have to bring it up. You don't have to make it feel more painful, and you shouldn't. But if you talk to somebody, you meet them for the first time, and you say, you know how blah, 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 if they're feeling that pain, they're going to be like, yup,
yeah.
right? So, are there other thoughts you have on how you might be able to incorporate that framework with the small business optimizer part of it so that it all tells that story?
Well, I guess that I like the idea of opening with that versus even saying, and then maybe the closing is as your small business optimizer, right? Like you know how entrepreneurs do this. Here's what I do as a, because I think that's good is because when you lead with it, sometimes people are still processing or turning it over in their mind, and they may not even be listening to those next couple sentences. So by not leading with the role, I could see how that helps, cognitively where they're at, that it's, oh, okay, I can get my sink my teeth into the problem, and then from that, oh, you help with that. And then I say small business optimizer. And then they may still kind of think, oh, is that a coach? And then that opens that conversation. Well, it's not coaching, but there is definitely some strategy involved. And, we kind of go down that rabbit hole together.
For sure. And at that point, whether it's coaching or consulting or training, it doesn't really matter at that stage, right? It's
Right.
like that's the how. That's when you can dig into the, well, what does that look like? What does it look like to work with you? That's part of the later conversation. At the beginning, it's just, are you even relevant to me? Especially in a networking thing where, again, honestly, most people are there. What are they there for?
To sell their things.
Okay. So just in the context of keeping it within the dynamic of the environment you're in, very different than if you're speaking somewhere and somebody comes up to you, right? That conversation is very different. They've seen you speak, they're now coming up to you. You now have context to them, and there's something that you talked about that they feel resonates with the problem they have. Now you're talking about a very different conversation, right? Where they
Yeah.
might go right into, well, how do you do that? Okay, so now they understand that. And now the trick is too, you think about, well, how does that approach to it? that might work better. It might not work better, but what, it's worth trying. But that might be more effective in a networking or a live situation where you meet somebody. But how does that apply now to what's on your website, to your messaging, to your LinkedIn? Are there ways that when you think about your website and how you basically present yourself at the homepage, somebody lands on your homepage or they look at your LinkedIn about, does it start with the try to explain what an optimizer is, small business optimizer is, right?
I think, yeah, I think it's very sim. I think it starts the way the elevator pitch kind of did.
Mm.
I will say, I think my website, in fact, I know my website starts with, if you're a busy entrepreneur looking for ways, welcome. I do have that kind of welcome message, but then it transitions into the small business optimizer. And what does that mean? And even have like FAQs around what is that? How is it different from a coach? But that I think that invitation in, I do have in the print on the website, but you're right, I haven't done that in an elevator pitch, kind of put on the spike conversationally. Um, so that's an intriguing new perspective, is
Then
to really start with the problem.
yeah, it's just an angle from which to approach it. Because again, messaging in general, whether it's in person or whether it's on your website or however you're doing it, is always difficult because it means making hard choices, right? There's only we can't solve every problem. We
Yeah.
we could try, but how do we communicate that clearly, right? So when you think about, you mentioned what was on that, you said the first thing people see on the website is, are you a busy?
Yeah, if you're a busy entrepreneur looking for, and I can't remember the rest of the sentence, but it's something about, clearing the chaos, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because here even you think about like the specificity of a problem, right? So I'm not saying anything bad about like the clearing click chaos, whatever, because that's people can relate to that, right? But you think
Mm,
about like the most more specific the problem is described that's in their language, the easier it is to actually resonate with them and get them to go like, what?
mm.
So now the challenge is there's lots of different types of people. We don't want to narrow ourselves so much that only one out of like, there's like three prospects in the whole world for what you do, right? So going
Yeah.
back to the real estate agent example, if they only work with retirees who are looking to sell their home and gift the amount, the capital gains to their children and then move to Florida, well, they'd probably like lock in that market, but they'll probably have like three clients a year, right? If that.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of balance to it. But when you think about like even on your website, even the leading thing that comes in is, how ways that you might be able to describe the problem. If you look back to your best clients, how did they describe the problem, right? What are the words
Yeah.
they used?
Well, I'll tell you, and again, this is the educational side of me. I have a bingo card on my website, and I call it Entrepreneur Bingo. And it's, give yourself a check mark for every one of these sentences. And there's like what, 9 boxes? And it's like, if you're winning at this game of bingo, we need to talk. So I've kind of done that. I had seen something similar on another website and I loved it. I'm like, because again, that felt very on brand, very resonant. I'm like, I've made bingo cards before for, review games. So that's kind of helped if somebody takes the time to engage with it and read it. But it's, some of it's facts, some of it's if you feel this, or, are these phrases you've said before? Check, check, check. If you're winning the bingo,
So winning is really not winning, right? Winning is like you've got these really big challenges or difficulties, but
yeah, you're facing a lot. Oh, yep, yep,
yep.
that's me. Oh, that resonates. I've said that. Yeah.
No, that I love that. I mean, that's, to your point, getting them to actually to that part of it might be,
Yeah.
the heavier lift, but yeah, you're just looking at it and saying, it's the spirit of it is looking at and saying, like, my messaging is all about them, right?
Mm.
It's all about their world, their challenge. And it doesn't mean being negative. Sometimes people will think, well, if you just focus on their problem, they're just being negative. We want to focus on positive. We're not talking about like drilling down on the problem and making it seem bigger than it is or making them scared or using fear. It's just they can relate to it or they can't, right? And that theme, however you think of if you want to incorporate that into your introduction to people in a live event or into your website or your LinkedIn or whatever it is you do, what it does is it really just is like it takes a lot of the pressure off of you, of me, of us, right? We're trying to sell our services, of trying to like nail the thing we're going to say that's so captivating. Because the challenge with that is that it's always about us, right?
Yeah.
It's like even if I were to describe what I do, like, oh, what's the most clever, captivating way I can do it? This is one of my things, my pet peeves with the whole idea of personal branding, right? Personal branding is like branding by definition is what other people perceive of your service, your company, whatever. It's always about other people's perspective. Personal branding as a thing has become our our selfies on LinkedIn, or kind of like the image that we want to create. It's like that's nice. Image is important. It hopefully is authentic, right? But
Yeah.
ultimately, personal branding isn't about us. It shouldn't be about us to that extent.
Well, and I feel like I see that, like, especially people who are heavily on Instagram, that it's so much about the aesthetic, the vibe, that, and I can see that there's a part, like, especially, like, let's say you're in the wedding industry and potential brides, couples are looking, like, then maybe it is, ooh, that aesthetic appeals, that's what we want. But I think it's hard to not just get into that superficial, dreamy, the colors, the filters, the font, and more about if you're more service based, if it really is, here's a problem, here's
That's a good example what you said about the, depending on the industry. Like, let's go back to real estate real quick. That might be perfectly appropriate to show a beautiful home that you just got. It's still about them and their story. So even in the wedding industry, it's still them imagining, picturing them in that world, right? Fashion might be similar to that, right? So there's differences with this. We're talking a lot of times just B to B. That doesn't
yeah.
mean there should be an aesthetic. There is a style to this, of course, right? The branding, the visual branding is important, but ultimately, it really comes down to like Donald Miller. Who I don't know if we talked about him, but yeah, I bring up his book a lot. Build Your Story Brand. I think it's called Building Your Story Brand. He takes the hero's journey, basically that story arc, way we think as human beings. I'm sure you relate to
Yeah.
this as a teacher. We think in terms of archetypes, right? So there's the hero, the guide, the villain, that stuff. So trying to like basically tell your story as a business owner or as an entrepreneur or as a consultant from the story, right? So if you think about a lot of times, if it's like, well, I'm this, like if I were to meet you and I said, well, what I do is a marketing ninja, or whatever, like,
Right.
well, I'm the hero of that story. I shouldn't be the hero of the story. You're the hero of the story. I might be the guide if I do the right job and and you feel like
Yeah.
I can relate to you or you can relate to me.
Yeah, I like that because that's it, is I think especially, as coaches, consultants, is that we are the cheerleader and not just the cheerleader. I'm not just going to say good job, but I'm like behind the scenes helping. A metaphor I use with my clients is like, I just help polish the diamond. Like this is your diamond. This is you're great at what you do. I'm just polishing it, and I think that's important because it's not that they're not good at what they're doing. It's not that they necessarily have a missing component so much as it is that behind the scenes support that really lets them free up that time. So I can see that.
Totally. I love that analogy. You're helping them shine the diamond. They're the diamond, right?
Yeah.
So, the whole thing, hopefully this kind of a little bit of a shift in the perspective is helpful, right? So when you're thinking about, you are a small business optimizer. If you establish the context first from their perspective, now at least from from this seat, right? When you say, were to say small business optimizer, that makes a lot more sense to me, right? As a prospect, because I understand the context of what you're doing, as opposed to if you start with that, to your point earlier, they're still figuring out what that means and they're not even hearing what you're saying.
Hmm. Yeah.
So what are there as we start to kind of wrap up, are there any thoughts you have, like of other places you might apply this, or gaps in this that you'd want to fill before we jump off?
Thank you. This actually has brought me a lot of clarity. I don't think so because ultimately, right, the whole thing is it's an invitation to be curious, right? Like Ted Lasso tells us, to be like, so you want to have a little bit of a mystery where someone digs in more, um, but to not feel that the step, well, what do you do? Question answer, that it is to kind of just shuffle the order around. I really like that. I think that's important. And that'll help with the better conversation and then kind of prime people. So when I say the job title, that's either not where it stops or they kind of are more receptive to it because it can land a little easier. So that makes a lot of sense.
Special thanks to Pamela King for joining me on the show. If you enjoyed the show, I hope you consider subscribing and leaving a review. And don't forget to visit marcusschaller.com/subscribe for weekly troubleshooting guides and tips to help you find and fix the weak spots in your marketing that are holding you back, fine tune your positioning and marketing strategy, and start growing again by attracting more of your ideal clients. Again, that's marcusschaller.com/subscribe.